Okay, sounds great. Hey, thanks everyone for joining in on this kickoff webinar for the Washington Water Audit Pilot. You're hearing Mike Dexel here from State Department of Health, and really excited that all of you are on the call and to work with this team of experts that we have lined up from Water Systems Optimization and Kavanaugh and Associates. I think you guys are really going to be pleased and learn a lot from this group. I was just at the last week at the North American Water Loss Conference that was down in San Diego, and you had experts on water loss control from all over the world. And it was really enlightening to kind of work with these experts. And what was great is that everybody knows who WSO and Kavanaugh is. So these guys are kind of known worldwide. And that's exciting for me as a regulator, knowing that we're working with one of the best teams out there. So in terms of what we're going to do today, we'll do some introductions to start. You're going to really just hear from me briefly today. I'm going to turn it over to the project team here in just a few slides. And they're going to go through kind of water loss reporting in the U.S. and kind of where we've come up to this point. I'll give you, from my perspective, kind of what it means as a regulator in terms of looking at the water efficiency program and how the work that you'll be doing under the audit links to that program. Talk a lot about what these water audits are, the methodology there, and all the other good stuff, the data request and next steps. So that's kind of how we'll do the presentation, and hopefully you guys can learn a lot from this. So again, from my perspective, I just want you guys to all understand kind of where this is coming from. This project team you're working with has actually been working with other states doing pilot projects using EPA set-asides for capacity building. That is what we have used here at DOH to do the same thing. Again, there's 10 utilities participating in this pilot. I would love to see the pilot being expanded to a much larger group of municipal systems in the state of Washington, and there's reasons for that, and I'm going to go through that. But just so you know, that's where this funding is coming from. Looking back, right, for the last 10 years, all of you have been reporting data to the state on water efficiency, which is, as you know, linked to volume losses, annual volume losses, percentage losses, and kind of what that 2-year average looks like. From a regulatory perspective, we judge that based on whether or not you're at 10% or not. A number of the utilities who are participating in this pilot don't necessarily have more than 10% losses, right? So you're underneath that 10% mark. But I think what you're going to learn through this process is that percentage isn't really the best indicator, and how do we actually look closer at our data and try to evaluate water loss beyond just what the state regulations say. So my goals for you, again, number one, are going to be improved capacity, and that's just for the full spectrum of technical, managerial, and financial capacity. And I know the team's going to touch on this a lot throughout the process, so you're going to learn a lot from that. Hopefully, at the utility level, you're going to have much more confidence in the data that you're collecting. From my perspective, knowing that the data that you're submitting is being evaluated and validated, it gives me better confidence in the data that's being reported to the state, so that when we're reporting out to our agency leaders or even legislators about how water efficiency is progressing over time, we're going to have better confidence in the data that's coming in through this data validation effort that you're going to be doing. In addition, my hope for you is that whatever funding you're spending on water loss control within the utility is going to be better targeted in terms of where you should be tracking down these losses and where that non-revenue water exists within the utility. So obviously, with that comes better water loss control management. And then, one of the reasons why we've asked more than just one person to participate at the utility is because we really want the different departments to be talking to each other. Yeah, you may say you're already doing that, and that's great. I think this project team's going to really just impart the importance for that and make sure that you guys are collecting the data as best as you can and talking between the departments to get that information. And then finally, as a participant on the pilot, we're really wanting you all to champion this effort, the use of the water audit and validating the data, and be able to explain kind of how this helped you move forward. To be an example, and again, we know there's a 10% water loss standard out there, but what you can demonstrate to the state, I think, and just kind of showing what you've done to look beyond the state regulations and reducing losses, I think really goes a long way. And our hope is that you'll be able to kind of share that with some of your peers. So next slide, please. So looking back again, some of the guiding questions for me is whether or not over the last 10 years, as you've reported percentage losses, has that really moved you towards better supply side efficiency or supply side management? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. My guess is that for some of you, the answer is it's helped, and for others, you're kind of stuck. You're not really sure what to do next. Certainly, that's what I've heard from some of the pilot participants here. So again, it's just kind of looking beyond, what percentages and what else you can do differently. Digging deeper into the data, that's really kind of, from my perspective, what this is about. Using the audit, checking your numbers. Is the data that you're reporting, are you confident that it's good, or is it driving you nuts? I don't know. Again, a lot of you have told me certain things are really kind of driving you crazy and haven't been able to figure out what's going on. So this effort's going to try to get you there. And again, we have a state standard of percentage losses. A lot of other states are moving away from that. In fact, if you look at AWWA and the Water Loss Control Committee, this whole percentage thing is kind of drifting away, and there's a big push to use the water audit to evaluate water losses and look at non-revenue water. So you're going to hear a lot about terminology. As you know, the state has been really trying to move away from the unaccounted for water term. That's something that's not even recognized anymore by AWWA. So let's not use that. In the state, we use distribution system leakage. That's kind of been our term. But looking beyond the state of Washington, again, there's more of this kind of concept of, well, what's the non-revenue water? When you look at kind of water loss in a system, whether it's apparent or real losses, the non-revenue piece is really important. So you're going to hear a lot about that too. And then not only are we doing data validation, but to do that on an ongoing annual basis is going to be very important. Part of this audit, using this audit is not just using it this year and through this pilot project, but we'd really like you to kind of do this on a year-to-year basis to figure out ongoing what is going on with your data and how to validate that and why that's important. So next slide. So that's about all you're going to hear from me. Now you see some pictures of some of the folks you're going to be working with. At this point, I really kind of turn it over to this project team. You might hear from me a little bit. I might be checking up with you through a phone call or email to see how things are going. But for the most part, this is the group you're going to work with. And so again, really excited to be working with the team. And for now, I'll turn it back to them.
Great. Thank you, Mike, for the introduction. Great setting the stage of what's happening and from the state's perspective. This is Will Jernigan. I'm the one with the brown hair, second from the right. Thank you so much for being with us today. My cohort will be Lucy Andrews. We'll be kind of sharing the presentation duties for the rest of the content in today's webcast, and then we'll have an opportunity to do some Q&A, which the team can all participate in at the end of this one. So if you do have questions, there are two ways you can let us know that. One is to type them into the chat box as we go through, and you can do that along the way. The other is just to jot it down, and when we get to the end, we'll open up the microphones and have an open Q&A session. So please do write those down as we go, or type them in the chat box, and we'll make sure to have some good discussion at the end. Drew and Reinhard are other team members shown there. So we're jazzed to be working on this program. As Mike mentioned, we've done many others in other states, and each one is kind of its own unique and exciting project. It really, the way this one's being done has taken lessons learned from other states, but it's also in some ways kind of its own thing as well. And one of the reasons for that is a good diversity of pilot participants. So you folks on the phone, from really the diversity that we were looking for in the group was geographical as well as size of utility. So you can kind of get a lot of ways that we'll have some common discussions, but at the same time that you're working side by side with your peers in a shared learning environment. We have observed, that's not just talk, we have observed directly in other states' programs where there is shared learning in a type of program like this, it enhances the overall likelihood that these practices will stick. And that's really, at the end of the day, I think Mike said it well, that managing water loss, water system efficiency, doing that is a business practice. It's not a one and done type of thing. You don't just do an audit and then put it on the shelf and you're good to go. You don't do a bunch of leak detection and you're good to go. Your network, your metering system, your overall infrastructure, it is a dynamic thing. It continues to age, and as long as it continues to age, the efficiency of the system will continue to move in a degrading condition. So you have to actually have a system in place to manage that. So we're going to be learning about how these business processes get implemented, and it all starts with the water audit. So we'll get into some of the technical foundations today. But before we do, let's take a quick look at some of the thoughts that came from our pilot group. So you folks on the phone, we issued a survey ahead of this. So this is kind of a polling the audience, if you will. What are some of the reasons that you're participating in this program? And really interesting responses. Additional water supplies, reducing losses, and the relationship between when we recover loss within the system, specifically leakage. It's part of the equation. That offsets what we have to withdraw from our supply. So it's in essence a hidden supply within your system, and that's a great way to think about it. Learning about the AWWA process, and also a comment about consistency and how these calculations are done and standard format across the state. So I'll show in a moment what's happening in other states relative to water auditing and water loss reporting, and it'll give you a sense of how this comment, the third comment here, is really something that's resonating nationally. It's a very, very big deal that the industry is moving towards an accepted standard best practice for how to conduct the water balance, and then how to calculate performance indicators and how to use those to guide cost-effective implementation and water loss intervention. So a lot of good stuff there. One more survey question we'll take a look at before we dive into the pilot program discussion today. What are some of the goals that you have as a participant in the program? Gaining perspective on different water accountability tools and practices. I see some others like to see the state look at the AWWA software, adopt it as the format. I think as it stands right now, it is guidance is provided on the state's website, and it's kind of a recommended practice, but there's not necessarily a mandate that that's the way it has to go. So that's one feedback from a participant. And then maybe touching on that last one, to have a plan. And we like to say that when you do a water audit, you actually don't save any water. Actually, when you do a leak detection survey, you don't save any water either. The water savings occurs when you intervene and stop a given leak or address a particular loss issue with implementation. But you can't do that without a plan, or you can't. I should say you can't be cost effective at doing that without a plan. And the plan is very much what this program is focused on getting to. It starts with the AWWA audit, which informs an understanding of what our loss profile is, and that therefore guides which intervention activities are most appropriate, how much, and where. So those are sort of the key questions. Great feedback. Thanks for those who responded in the survey ahead. Now shifting our perspective to what the goals of the overall program are. as Mike touched on from the state's perspective, overall improvement in capacity building, technical, financial, and managerial are the sort of the terms that are typically used there. But what that really means is improving the financial resiliency of the water utility. And as you'll learn through this program, addressing non-revenue water issues very much does that, or helps to improve sustainability. The relationship between your revenues and expenses is impacted by how much non-revenue water and what form it's taking in your system. And I want to touch on the managerial capacity, building on one of Mike's introductory comments, which is about the team and who all from your utility is participating in this program. And on purpose, we have asked for different departments to be represented. We observe that non-revenue water is one of those rare issues that has kind of a reach into literally every department, all the way up to management and elected officials, and even outside stakeholders, the media, your ratepayers. This is an issue that for good or for better or worse, brings people together, as it really has an impact on all the different departments, and it takes input from all the different departments to inform the audit, to inform the validation process, and then when it comes time to implement water loss control activities, there is no one department that owns that. It requires multiple departments to be involved, because non-revenue water is a complex issue. It's not just leakage, which you will learn through this, and you probably already knew that, but we'll be talking more about that as we go. So, other things, just to mention water conservation. We like to say that water loss is kind of low-hanging fruit when it comes to conservation, because it is, again, on your side of the meter, and those things will probably which you have maybe the most control over. When we reduce water losses, it reduces the amount required for withdrawal from the source, or if you're purchasing water, the amount that you have to purchase. So it is a very potent form of water conservation. And of course, the compliance with the 10% standard. But you notice that's listed last because this is clearly more than just kind of a checkbox or a type of activity. There are multiple and multidimensional benefits when non-revenue water is improved within the system. And there you can see some tools that we'll be talking about as we go through. What is it that you can expect to get out of this program? We are going to be working with you, and this will be a combination. We'll look at the structure of the program and what types of activities you'll be doing. But in general, it's a combination of group learning in a classroom environment and one-to-one work where we are specifically looking at your data. And we do that on purpose. That combination of group learning and individual attention is by design. That provides guidance on how to collect the data, how to compile the water audit using that data, what to do to review the data with an eye for validation, and assessing how reliable, how maybe more reliable or less reliable that data is. We will be together in a physical workshop, which we'll look at in just a moment. And then outcomes will be utility-specific recommendations for things that make sense for your utility as a set of next steps towards implementing a water loss control program. Ultimately, the outcomes of this whole program with all 10 utilities will be summarized in a report, as well as some individualized guidance on next steps. So before we dial into the sort of the nuts and bolts of the program, just a quick look at what's happening around the country. You can see a gradation there of where different states are at. A lot of folks are still in the just bare white category, where there's not even a water loss reporting requirement. And pale blue, we've got a few that are in kind of a basic reporting. That's very much the pumped versus sold, unaccounted for, something really as rudimentary as that in some states. And then you can see some states in dark blue have moved towards a WWA methodology, Washington being one of those, adopting the terminology that is consistent with the water balance, moving away from the unaccounted for language and towards a process that breaks water loss into its components. And that's sort of a central tenet of the AWWA methodology. And then other states that have adopted the AWWA tool, which actually introduces an element of data grading and validation, which are they're at the front of the pack. So you can see that this is very much maybe even a bit of a tipping point where states are really starting to pay close attention to the standardized industry accepted format, the process of validation, and reliability in their information. So this is a very, very important step forward for Washington. But as you can see, this is stuff that's going on all around the country in a great way. Some other states that have done a technical assistance program similar to the one that you're participating in now. You can see there a handful. Really, these are more pilot level programs with a small number of systems. So in a great way, you never really want to be the first one out there to do. You don't want to buy the first model of the iPhone, but once they come out with the second or third, you tend to really get onto maximizing the best parts of it. So Washington's in a good spot with that respect. There are other states in the U.S., California and Georgia, Hawaii specifically, that have done well beyond pilot programs where they've done very large scale, reaching every utility. This is an example of a pilot program that's intended, as we've stated, to test out some proof of concept and really see how well, and it is expected to fit well with Washington utilities, but the AWWA methodology, and to get it in place to document those benefits with testimonials and pilot utility participation. So let's turn our attention to this program, this pilot water loss program, and I'm just going to give a quick overview of the pieces and parts, and then I'm going to ask Lucy to carry us through putting the bricks in the foundation of the house on the nuts and bolts of what we will be learning about through the course of the program. But in general, we're going to begin with today's webinar. Obviously, you guys we've been in touch. You've agreed to participate, which we're very grateful for and glad to have you in. Following today's webinar, we're going to be in what we would consider the data gathering phase, where we are going to be providing you with a data request, and later on in the webcast we will touch on what specific data that we are going to be asking you to do. We'll refer you to the resources that we're making available that will be helpful as you gather that data. And then we're going to get together in early part of next year for a workshop where we will be doing a couple of things. We'll be doing some group learning and reinforcement on technical concepts that are associated with doing an audit, the validation process, interpreting the outcomes of an audit, as well as individual utility review on your specific audit. So again, this is a combination of classroom and one-to-one attention that will be taking place in the workshop environment. Finally, reflection and planning will be pulling all that together as the recommendations for next steps. So what does that look like on a timeline? Real broad strokes here. We are in December of the webcast. The data gathering will go through the early part of February, and I'll share the deadline on your data submittal in just a moment. Our workshop is March 5th through 8th, so save the date. Hopefully you have already. That's when we're physically going to be getting together. This is being brought to a town near you, so we are going to be traveling around the state to a handful of different locations. So you'll have a reasonable drive to get to your nearest workshop location. And we'll be sharing. We haven't gotten those exact venues nailed down at this point, but generally we'll be able to get those provided to you soon. So for the moment, just make sure you have March 5th through 8th blocked, and one of those days will be your workshop day, where it is near you. After the workshop, we will provide a post-program survey to make sure we harvest feedback while it's fresh from your experience, and then developing the outcomes of the program, next steps, recommendations, and then sort of wrapping it all up in high-level conclusions and observations in spring of 2018. One thing I will mention, and I'll come back to this and remind you towards the end of the webcast, right about here just ahead of the data deadline in February, we will ask you to fill out a very brief practices survey that just gives us a few key points on what some of your operational practices are. Those will be helpful as we are reviewing the data that you've uploaded to us. And it won't take very long. It'll be a brief survey, but we're not giving it to you now. We want you to be kind of free and clear to collect your data for the next month or two, and then right as that deadline's approaching, we'll be having you fill out that brief survey. So survey before, survey after is part of the process. With that, I am going to make sure all of our tech is in order and pass the microphone to Ms. Lucy and ask Lucy to take us through some of the foundational concepts that we will be learning about in the rest of the program, but we need to hear about them now so that we've got some reinforcement of those concepts as we go. So Lucy, I'm going to pass the screen share to you. Make sure I don't blow this thing up. Coming your way.
Thank you, Will.
Great.
How's the screen sharing coming through? And can you hear me? Is it looking good?
Yes, on both accounts.
Fantastic. Hi, everybody. This is Lucy from the WSO side of things. And now I get to walk us through some of the fundamental terminology that applies to the water auditing process. We'll talk about the water balance, the process of volumetric accounting that allows us to ultimately assess how much water you're losing to various forms of water loss. This is just a first introduction. Some of the terminology may be familiar, some of it not. And know that the goal of this program will be to reinforce this over the next few months. If you have any questions, feel free to either note them and be ready to ask them at the end of our session, or to use that chat function. Drew Blackwell, one of the program team folks, is monitoring that, and we'll make sure that those questions get an answer by the end of this webcast. So what you're seeing on the screen in front of you is a graphical, simplified representation of the water balance, the primary tool that we in the industry use to track volumes of water as they enter the distribution system, go to various legitimate uses, and then perhaps are lost, whether to leakage or some sort of measurement or data management inaccuracy. The ultimate goal here is to understand your total volume of real loss, leakage, which you'll note is on the bottom toward the right-hand side. But because this is a process of deduction, in order to get there, we also have to understand how much water you supply to begin with, how much you sell to customers, how much you might use for operational purposes or community uses like firefighting, and then how much water does actually get to a customer, but because of metering inaccuracy or some difficulty with tracking, you don't have any record of that water's delivery. All of this is relevant to our understanding of leakage. So in compiling a water audit, you'll have to engage with folks who seem very far away from leakage, whether because they manage your customer billing platform or all the way upstream at your pumps or sources of water. The other thing I'll highlight in this tool and in this water balance is that on the far right, we've got the volume of non-revenue water. We're pretty precise with our terminology in this game of water loss assessment and distinguish between the volume of water loss and the volume of non-revenue water. Certain volumes of water, for example, use that might be unbilled, but otherwise quite authorized, things like park irrigation, your own flushing or street sweeping, these sorts of uses, might not be revenue generating, and so we'd call them non-revenue water, but they're also not a volume of water loss. We want to make sure our distinctions are clear there. So in this tool, we'll be sorting your volumes of consumption into various categories, and in it, we'll be preserving the volume of supply across this tool. So starting on the left, water supplied is a full column. To its right, authorized consumption plus water losses, another full column, is the same volume. It's a mass balance, so there's some preservation here. Here's a mathematical representation of that, where input into the system is 100 units of supply. As we move right, you'll note that each full column continues to capture those 100 units of supply. In this process, no water disappears or is unaccounted for. Instead, by the end, we're accounting for all of our different sorts of water volumes, beginning with that fundamental volume of supply. So it's important to get that supply right, because once we've decided how much water hits the potable distribution system, we're then going to allocate it to various forms of authorized use or water loss. So starting with that volume of supply, we distinguish between the different types of supply, depending on whether you yourself produce and treat the water, or whether you purchase it from a neighboring agency. The three categories that will be relevant to your assessment of supply are going to be volume from own sources, typically water that you treat, water imported, typically water that another agency treats and then sells to you, and then water exported, water that you might deliver to a neighboring agency in a bulk or a wholesale fashion. Sometimes folks may purchase raw water and then treat it themselves, and you could consider that either a volume from own source because you're responsible for the treatment process, or a volume of water imported because the ultimate source of the water is an import. For those sorts of scenarios, we'll be sure to touch on them in our in-person and one-on-one attention. So bring questions about how your system maps onto these volumes, and we'll be sure to address them. When we're compiling a water audit and trying to understand the volume of supply that hits our potable distribution system, it's important to draw a geographic boundary around our system so that we can understand, for example, if we have redundant meters, which one is going to be relevant to our water audit. Looking at this system, for example, you'll note that they have a raw water meter toward the top that meters water entering a treatment plant, and then they have a finished water meter for water that leaves the treatment plant. Ideally, the raw water meter and the finished water meter should measure similar volumes. There may be some process loss, but the volume should be comparable. But ultimately, we only want to use the volume that one meter reports. Ideally, that would be the finished water meter because that meter is closest to the distribution system that we're auditing. But if that meter was installed recently and so there's not a lot of historical data behind it, or if the meter's been on the fritz lately, maybe we have to go upstream. So the first step when you're compiling your water audit is going to be sketching a schematic of all of your source meters and identifying which ones are going to be relevant to the volume of water hitting the distribution system. Another example for this utility, they have two potable interties and then an insertion meter that measures the water coming from both of those interties. So if those interties are metered, they have the choice to use either the intertie meters, a pair of meters, or the insertion meter, a single meter measuring both volumes. This system has decided that they're going to use the potable intertie meters. In this case, it looks like that insertion meter may not be an ideal instrument, given its installation conditions or how it's been maintained. So some of the details you'll have to reckon with is how much confidence you place in your supply meters. If you've got the choice between one meter or another, is one of those assets more reliable? We'll happily have those conversations as you're compiling your water audit. You'll also want to, of course, note meter ownership, whether you own that meter or a neighboring agency owns the meter, and also reckon with the volume that you keep in storage, since that may contribute to supply and may not be metered. We'll talk about that and make sure to capture it in the water audit too. Another valuable component then of the water audit when it comes to the volume of supply is how we consider the accuracy of your instruments as contributing to the volume of supply that hits the distribution system. If a meter registers 100 units but is inaccurate, we'll have to adjust the 100 units that it measured for its inaccuracy. The question then becomes, how do we diagnose inaccuracy? Well, it depends on what type of meter we're talking about and whether we can test it volumetrically or whether we can calibrate it by taking a look at its electronics, and then how we consider data management on top of that meter, whether with a SCADA system or some other method of data collection. We will distinguish in our conversations this spring between volumetric testing of a source meter and calibration of a source meter. Volumetric testing attends to the accuracy of the actual measurement element itself, where we pass a volume of water through the meter and take a look at how accurate the meter's registration was. So for example, we might draw a volume from a tank, determine how much that volume is with the tank's dimensions, and then compare it to the totalizer read on our meter. That's a distinct activity from an electronic calibration, where there's no water actually involved in the process. Instead, we work with electronics and, for example, a 4 to 20 milliamp signal to make sure that the electronics are converting it appropriately, given how it's scaled. Calibration of a meter can give us insight into how that meter may be performing, but it doesn't incorporate things like installation conditions in assessing accuracy. You could calibrate a meter and it could seem accurate in its electronics, but if it's installed in a very turbulent flow location, for example, its volumetric accuracy may suffer. So we do want to keep our assessment of the practices of volumetric testing and calibration quite distinct, and recognize that both are important in understanding the accuracy of our supply metering assets, to then ultimately understand how much water passed through them and hit the distribution system as the foundation of our water audit. If we are able to assess source meter inaccuracy and adjust for it in the water audit, that can of course change our understanding of leakage at the end of it. In this little graph here, you'll note that on the left, we have the base case, where we assume that a meter is 100% accurate and that everything it registers is indeed water that passed through it. It didn't miss anything. When we diagnose that meter's inaccuracy, though, and note that it is under-registering by 5%, a pretty common occurrence, when we compare the volume that went through it adjusted for the under-registration to what was sold, there's more left over that ultimately ends up assessed as leakage. So our understanding of supply meter accuracy, when it trickles all the way down through the distribution system, can consequently affect our insight into leakage. This is a top-down tool where we're going to be assessing volumes of supply and volumes of sales and volumes of authorized use to then get to water loss. So we've got to make sure our fundamentals, our foundation of supply is accurate. There are a few different ways to test source meters, and we can talk about the configurations you have available if volumetric testing is of interest, whether that's with a comparative meter or using a nearby tank or reservoir. Those are all options. Once we've understood our volume of supply by accounting for what we ourselves produce, what we might import for a neighboring agency, and then subtracting what we export in a wholesale fashion to the neighbors, we can move into the world of authorized consumption. And this is water that goes to a legitimate and approved purpose, whether or not it is billed, whether or not it is metered. Most folks, of course, will see that the majority of their authorized consumption is in the form of billed and metered sales to standard customers like single-family homes, like commercial businesses, perhaps some civic institutions. That might all be considered billed, metered consumption. Or if you still have a few accounts that are unmetered, billed, unmetered consumption. We've also got legitimate volumes of use that aren't billed and don't generate revenue. Oftentimes, this is internal agency use, so this could be in your own office building, or it could be for firefighting purposes or infrastructure maintenance. Those are still legitimate uses that we'll want to acknowledge as a form of authorized consumption. And again, you'll note here with the volumes presented, we have 90 total units of authorized consumption that are allocated across the categories billed metered consumption, billed unmetered consumption, unbilled metered consumption, and unbilled unmetered consumption. That total adds up to 90. So this tool allows us to make sure that in our accounting, we're accounting for everything. Some of the volumes you may have more information about than others. Typically, folks are keeping a pretty close eye on their billed metered sales, but volumes that are unbilled and unmetered are a little harder to pin down. First of all, they don't have a meter, so we're stuck with some estimation tools here. And secondly, because the water is not revenue generating, it may be of lower priority. You may have fewer staff taking a look at that number, quite understandably. So we'll do our best to make as many reasonable estimates as we can, and there are default options available to us where information is missing here. The name of the game for things like unbilled, unmetered consumption is simple documentation of what we know, what we don't know, and then how we're going to fill in the gaps. Things that you may want to consider when you're compiling your own audit are your own facility use. Any tank overflow or tank draining, if you're cleaning a tank or maintaining it, where'd that water go? If you have lubrication water re-entering a well shaft after the point of metering, that may be a form of authorized use that we want to consider. Firefighting is another one, sometimes hard to estimate, but we'll want to document our estimate nonetheless. Looking here at main breaks, we want to distinguish between the volume of water that is lost as leakage versus any water that is used in repair, for example, post-repair flushing. So we'll want to get into the details there and make sure that we categorize leakage distinctly from flushing water. Another option, flat rate condominiums. If you're delivering water to a flat rate customer, how can we understand the volume as independent from the bill. Again, this is a volumetric exercise, so we'll have to consider those circumstances. You may have irrigation accounts that receive free or subsidized water. We'll want to make sure that those end up in the right box. And then, a more standard single family that has a meter and purchases water, that of course will belong here too. And when we're categorizing all of these different volumes, the first question to ask is the water billed and revenue generating, or unbilled and not revenue generating? And then once we have a sense of its billing and revenue status, we'll want to ask, is that water metered or is it unmetered? And so we're having to estimate it, whether with some general estimate or maybe the number of Vector truck fills. That's not metered, but it's a pretty robust estimate. Those would be considered unmetered uses. So when you're coming up with your census of authorized consumption, ask yourself, is it billed or unbilled? Is it metered or unmetered? We'll spend a lot of time digging specifically into your volume of billed and metered sales, since it tends to be quite significant and actually account for the majority of the water that you supply. In the process of assessing consumption that is billed and metered, we recognize that billing data management is a big job, and we'll want to understand how we can work with your billing system to capture specifically 12 months of use, given your billing frequency, and how you might capture adjustments, and what you do to fix zero reads or failed reads. All of those things will have to end up in our one summary number in the audit, and we'll do our best to document any cases where we're having to make manual adjustments or deal with the inherent idiosyncrasies of billing platforms. We do have an option to work in depth with you on extracting and analyzing and validating your billing data, which we'll talk about at the end of this webinar. So once you've assessed your volume of supply and then assessed your volume of authorized consumption, it's easy enough to subtract consumption from supply and end up with an estimate of water loss. But once we have an understanding of the total volume of water loss, we still don't have enough information to actually intervene. We don't know where the water loss is happening and what form it's taking. Customer metering inaccuracy, for example, is a very different problem from leakage. And if much of your water loss is in the form of delivered water that you didn't register, doing a proactive leak survey isn't going to remedy that issue. So we want to be a little bit more precise in our breakdown of water loss, so that once you diagnose the issue, you can apply the right treatment. In this process of top-down deduction, once we have the total volume of water loss, we then move to apparent losses before arriving at leakage. So in the apparent loss category, we've got three different volumes to consider. The first is unauthorized consumption, or theft. This is water that someone intentionally bypasses your ability to register or bill, and so we often have to guess at this volume. It's hard to track it down, but if you do have records of theft, we'll certainly be able to consider those. There's also the arena of customer metering inaccuracy, where we acknowledge that customer meters tend to under-register, and that their under-registration tends to worsen with use. And so the question becomes, what's the aggregate or bulk accuracy of your customer meter stock? Are they 99% accurate, 95% accurate? And given their inaccuracy, what's the consequence for your apparent loss volume? That's another area in which we often find ourselves dealing with incomplete information, and we'll do our best with what we've got. Things like the demographics of your meter stock, how old your meters are, what sizes they are and how you chose to size them, any maintenance you've done on particularly large meters, that will all be relevant here, as will customer meter test results. If you've ever done a volumetric test of customer meters, whether small meters that you put on a test bench or large meters that you test in place, we'll want to collect that information and figure out how we can extrapolate it to all of your meters, and if we can, what that looks like. And then lastly, in the apparent loss world, we've got the volume of apparent loss due to data handling errors. For example, if you have an errant billing program that drops a certain account in the second half of the year, we might consider that to be apparent loss due to data handling error, where you did deliver the water, but you don't have record of its use because of a billing platform issue. We'll want to consider those things. Again, we may be dealing with incomplete information, but that's not an impediment. We're looking for whatever information is available with then the job of documenting what we don't have. Most folks will experience the majority of their parent losses due to customer metering inaccuracy, and it tends to be consequential for your revenue, since this is water that's valued at your retail rate. We distinguish between your commodity charge that you charge to customers and your service charge or your flat monthly charge, however it is that you bill it, in our valuation of apparent losses. So when you're thinking about what your apparent losses are worth to you, so that you can then decide what you might want to do about them, what we consider is your variable or your commodity or your volumetric charge. You'll see in this instance, for example, we've got a customer meter that's 90% accurate on the left. That customer is billed $20 a month for a connection. That's a flat charge. That doesn't depend on the meter's accuracy, so that won't change if we change the meter. But their variable charge, $3 per 100 cubic feet, does depend on the accuracy, in that with inaccuracy, we lose money at that variable rate. So if we were to replace the meter and assume that we're installing a more accurate meter, we'll increase our revenue at that variable rate. So when we start to talk about water loss control, when we speak about apparent loss control, we're comparing the value of water at your retail rate to things like improved meter accuracy and what it might cost to update your metering stock. And then in one more fell swoop of deduction, we arrive at our understanding of leakage. So to back us up, we started with a volume of supply. We then deducted our authorized consumption, whether billed or unbilled, and metered or unmetered. And then we deducted our apparent loss estimate to arrive, lastly, at leakage. But not all leakage is the same. Some leakage is incredibly consequential, and maybe you find it, it's short-lived. Other leakage is small, insidious seeps and drips that go on for years, but that are difficult to diagnose and remedy. So the water audit doesn't attend to the different types of leakage. It just ultimately ends with a total volume estimate of leakage. But in this pilot program, we do have the opportunity to dig deeper into your leakage volume with another analysis, a component analysis of real loss, depending on the availability of data. So do know that when we talk about water loss control in the leakage realm, leakage control, we use different strategies for different types of leakage. Leak detection, acoustic leak detection, will only find leaks that generate enough noise to be heard, whereas something like pressure modulation or pressure reduction can reduce seeps and drips throughout the system. So the game here is going to be diagnosis of the type of leakage you're experiencing so that we can then, again, apply the correct remedy. Typically, folks will value their leakage at production cost. This is distinct from apparent losses, which tend to be valued at retail rate. Real loss tends to be valued at however much it costs you to acquire the water, treat the water, and then distribute it with power, pumping charges, that sort of thing. If you're in a supply-limited context, maybe your leakage is worth more to you. Maybe you would turn around and sell it, so we could value it at retail rate. The value of your leakage is a conversation we'll have in person when we get together for a workshop this spring. But do know that you'll have to come up with inventories of treatment costs, chemical costs, pumping electricity, those sorts of things for the water audit. The last thing that the water audit does that I'll touch on before passing over to Will Jernigan again for more conversation about the specific water audit software tool is that the water audit ends up producing a suite of performance indicators that are best viewed as a suite in concert rather than as any one indicator. One of the helpful things we consider in performance indicators is what leakage for your system is going to be unavoidable. Zero leakage is never the goal, since that's impossible to achieve. Instead, a more useful point of reference is the leakage that, given your pipes and your pressure, we would consider to be the cost of doing business and kind of untouchable. Refer to that by the term unavoidable annual real loss, and that volume is system dependent. So you'll report on how many miles of mains you have, how many service connections you have, what pressure you operate, for us to be able to model the volume of leakage that in any given 12-month period would be unavoidable for your system. We can then compare what we estimate you actually leaked, so what would be considered technically unavoidable, to appreciate the opportunity out there for leakage reduction. Then on top of that, the goal will be to add a layer of cost benefit and understand just because leakage is technically recoverable, does that mean it's also cost effectively recoverable? We want to make sure that our actions here provide some return on investment, and the water audit will start us down that path. In order to get there, we do need to report on your infrastructure. The water audit software will ask for an average pressure, which can be difficult to come up with if you deal with a lot of topography or varying pressures or a lot of zones. But we'll do our best with whatever information is available, and the more information you have to describe pressure in this conversation, the better. You'll also need to report on your miles of distribution mains that are downstream of your boundary supply meters. So you may have a very long transmission line, for example, from a neighboring agency, but if that is upstream of your import meter, we're not going to count it. So we want to make sure that we're counting the miles of mains within the geographic boundaries of our water audit. And then lastly, in understanding technical minimum leakage for your system and, for example, the leakage that you experience normalized to your system size, we need to assess the count of service connections that are both active and inactive. Basically everything that's plumbed and pressurized and therefore susceptible to leakage, whether or not there's an end user actively drawing water through that connection. So that will also be captured in your water audit. And then lastly, because water loss management is inherently an economic question, we need a few cost parameters to get us started. The water audit software will request your total annual operating cost, which is meant to be all-inclusive. Basically, every dollar you have to spend in a year to keep the system alive for future years and to keep water flowing through the pipes. A lot of folks will include, for example, their capital budget in this total annual operating cost. It's not strictly O&M. We also need some sense of your customer retail cost, that commodity or that variable charge that you bill to your customers. Typically, this is a weighted average if you have multiple tiers or different classes, where we take all of the commodity revenue that you received in a year and divide it by the volume you sold. That will inherently weight any tiers or classes that you have. That will be used to value your apparent losses, water that you delivered but were unable to bill for. And then lastly, we need some understanding of how much you have to invest in producing a unit of water in a variable sense. So this is the cost of acquisition, whether that's a per acre foot or per million gallons groundwater extraction fee, or a per acre foot or per million gallons purchase fee from a neighboring agency. And then any treatment costs, for example, how much you might have spent on chlorine or treatment power. And then distribution costs, how much you spent on pumping electricity, pumping power, that sort of thing. These costs need to be variable in nature, where they will change depending on the volume of water or the volume of water you produce. Treatment plant operator salaries, for example, typically aren't variable. You don't tend to pay your operators by the gallon. If you did, they would produce a whole lot of water. So that's a fixed cost. We won't include that in your variable cost of production. Variable production cost is used to value leakage. The idea here being, if you reduce your leakage, what money are you saving? Well, you're saving on the cost of producing the leakage, the water that would then feed the leakage. With that, I'm going to return the screen to Will Jernigan here to speak about performance indicators and some of the additional outcomes of the audit software.
Sounds good. Thank you, Lucy, very much for the walk through the water balance and some of the data that, some of the types of inputs that go into the water balance. I'm going to take back screen control here. And as we round out our webcast content today, I'm going to first hit the performance indicators. These are numbers or metrics that are calculated within the tool, the AWWA tool. What I want to hit here is that these performance indicators are expressed in terms of the 3 V's you see on your screen. Volumes of loss by type, you see real and apparent, and that can be normalized on a per connection per day. We have one called the Leakage Infrastructure Index, which you'll learn about more in this program, but those are all expressions of how much volume is being lost and in what way. Values places the economic or the cost on it, using the cost data that Lucy just mentioned with retail rate structure, which informs those apparent losses, commercial losses, and then essentially a variable production cost, which informs how much your leakage is costing you, because leakage doesn't actually hit you at the retail rate, but it does hit you at what it costs you to treat and deliver, or if you're purchasing that water, of course, what it costs you to purchase it. And the third V expressed in validity grades that are assigned to water audit inputs and then a total score, which is an output. That is a measure of overall reliability of the audit based on the practices that are in place that inform the inputs and where the information is coming from. So as we go through, you will see these volumes, these values, and these validity expressions as performance indicators that come out. And what we'll be talking about in the workshop and in this program is how do you interpret that? What do they mean? How do you use that to decide what appropriate actions to take from there? So that's the general idea. You may notice that one metric we have not mentioned as the performance indicators is water loss as a percentage, and we do this knowing that the regulatory structure in Washington requires you to report things in terms of a percentage, and you actually have a threshold of performance that is the 10% threshold. So what we want to do is recognizing that is what it is and that's there. We also want to make sure that we convey there are some pretty major limitations with just the actual metric mathematically. So you have to do it, and so therefore you should do it per the regulatory environment, but know that percentages are subject to undue influence from the amount of water that you supply, which is really driven by your demand. So in this simplistic example, from even just 1 year to the next, if there's a reduction in consumption from 900 units to 700 units, but water loss levels remain unchanged or relatively level because of the magnitude of supply and the fact that percentage is a function of two numbers. It's a fraction, loss being on top of the fraction, supply being on the bottom of the fraction. Simply having a wet year in year 2 versus a drier year in year 1, maybe less irrigation demand, or whatever the case may be. Maybe it's conservation that's being enacted, which certainly has been observed in the arid states where folks are using less water. So that's the reality. In this case, though, the water loss percentage does show a relatively dramatic increase in percentage, although we know that not really to be the case. It's not telling the story of what's actually happening with water loss. So that's the major mathematical limitation with it. It's just subject to undue influence. So bear that in mind, and we'll be really dealing in terms of volumes and values and validity. Those are the metrics that we use to put together to decide what is the appropriate next step and to track performance over time. And those are the keys. A quick look at the AWWA water audit software, and this is the tool that you will be using in a moment. I'll actually show you the program website where you can click to access and download this tool. Just to get you quickly oriented, hopefully some of you on the call today have already had experience in working with this tool, or at least maybe downloaded it and played around with it just a little bit. The gist is that it has a reporting worksheet, several tabs in there, but this is the main tab that you interface with. And the central column is where volumetric inputs typically go. And to the right, each volumetric input up above on the upper part of the worksheet has a data grade that is assigned, and it's a 1 through 10. I'll talk about that in just a moment, but that's basically as the auditor and preparing the audit, that's what you're doing, providing an input and then assigning a grade that goes with that input. It is important to designate what unit of measure you are dealing with, if it be it million gallons or acre feet, whichever is the preferred or metric that you're going to be using, and then to designate the time period. As Lucy described, in the technically building out a water balance, you have to define a boundary. That's true spatially as well as temporally, or by time. It has to be a water balance and a water audit are bound by a specific time period and a specific geographic boundary. So it's important to do that. That comes into play when dealing with volumes that you extract from your billing system, because as many of you on the call probably already have experienced, timestamps aren't always aligned between when we measure supply and when we measure consumption. And depending on your read cycles, if you're a monthly read, or even if you're monthly read, but depending on when in the month you read, you may not always, and usually don't, have exact alignment of the measurement of supply volumes versus the measurement of consumption volumes. So all that things to keep in mind as you go through. We are going to ask you as part of your data gathering and providing data to us by the February deadline to download this sheet and use the data that you've gathered to go ahead and populate it. And if you have not done that before, don't fret. We'll just ask you to do the best that you can. There's no pass-fail here. Certainly, if you've worked with it before, that's great. And so that is part of what we are going to be asking for you to do in your part, getting ready for our early May workshop. Just a quick look at the data grading function within the AWWA tool. There, as I mentioned, there are little grade boxes beside each input, and it is upon you as you provide the input to then, if you hover your mouse over the box, a pop-up box appears, and there are 10 criteria, or 10 descriptions that actually include multiple criteria within each description. And the general idea is that you're looking for the highest grade where you meet or exceed all of the criteria in that grade, as well as the grades below it. And if you forget that rule of thumb, it is written right here in the tool above the start of those inputs. But the appropriate data grade, you're looking for the highest grade where you meet or exceed all of the conditions described in the grade. So if you read a 6 and you meet everything but 1, then what you would do is you'd fall back to a 4 and you'd read that. And if you meet or exceed those, then it'd be a 4 or possibly a 5 if you exceed everything in a 4, but don't meet everything in a 6. So that's the general rule of thumb. This is one of the parts that I would say folks typically have the most challenge with, just getting oriented to the language, and if you've not worked with it before. So the big caveat here is don't stress out about it. Do your best. We are going to be spending time in the workshop on this particular issue and working through the appropriate process for assigning those data grades. We would also very much encourage this should be a team discussion. And this is another example where the auditing process and generally just managing water loss requires input from multiple departments. Well, it is going to require input from multiple departments to be able to assign a grade for each of these inputs. So be ready for that. We encourage you to make sure that team communication is established, maybe getting everyone around the table together to walk through as a group on data grade selection as you're working on your end. So all of this we will be working again through in the workshop in March. So do the best you can, and we'll look forward to getting together in early March. The high-level comments that I wanted to touch on before we turn our attention to specifically what data we would like for you to provide are the benefits of water loss control. Really, in broad strokes, I've mentioned that non-revenue water is one of those rare issues that touches every part of the utility. Interestingly, it brings together lots of different business processes as well. And I personally have observed that through the auditing process, through the process of having to go and gather data to gain an understanding of the underlying process that data came from, to test assumptions, all of those things tend to improve our understanding of the business systems we have. I mean, in many cases, you move from, well, we've always just kind of clicked the button on the billing report, the option for running the monthly numbers that's been in there. The auditing process can oftentimes reveal perhaps some inconsistencies with really a billing tool as a billing system as a tool for getting bills out the door, which does that very well. Don't always align with the exact needs and purposes for developing a water balance. As an example, that timestamp issue, the meter reading cycles versus the supply measurement cycles and things like that. So the process of developing an understanding of your water audit, doing that as an annual practice, and then using that to implement water loss control program touches all of these other things. It informs optimal meter management practices. It can inform pressure management practices, even asset management, where the eventual replacement of the asset is informed by how loss is behaving. And an example we often hear is that we're prioritizing replacing pipes because the ones that have the highest frequency of the breaks. Where are we seeing the most breaks? Well, interestingly, sometimes those frequency of breaks can actually be related to pressure issues, not that the asset is at the end of its life and in need of replacement, but maybe that there's pressure transients that are at work in the area that are creating this frequency of breaks. And so water loss control can inform perhaps optimization of asset management as well as other things. So it's really central and core to back to that technical, managerial, and financial capacity. All of these different areas tied to that. So with that, I want to keep an eye on the time, make sure we have enough time at the end of our presentation here for questions. And I see that we do have actually several questions rolling in, which is fantastic. Let's take a quick peek at what data are we going to ask you to provide to us. And in a moment, I'm actually going to show you the program website, because we have developed that with the intent that everything you need in terms of resources, or if you have questions, usually it's on the website. And so that can save the step of having to reach out and maybe ask a question or send an email. All these things centrally located. We are asking for the data to be provided by February 12th, so early February. The data will apply to calendar year 16. Obviously, we're not done with calendar year 17, and in most cases, there's a necessary period after the year's closed out to really get a lot of the data that you need. So in practical terms, we're going to be using the calendar year 2016 as the benchmark year for the period of the data we request. In general, Excel is better than PDF. If PDF is all you have, that's okay. And the overall caveat I would put on this is if we ask you for something and you don't have it, or you have something that's close to it but not exactly what we're asking for, don't worry. Just do your best, provide it to us, and we will work with you, meet you where you are. So I really encourage you to do your best and don't sweat it too much. And as always, reach out to us if you do have questions. So what I'd like to do now actually is to do a quick peek at the website, and I want to show you. We're going to dive into the details of the data just for a moment, but I want to first show you where you go and get the information or the list of things that we're asking for. The program website is washingtonwaterloss.org, and click enter, and it does have a password protected, as you saw on the slide before. We had to consult with Edward Snowden, and he recommended a highly encrypted password. It is all lowercase, the word Washington. That's how you get into the website. And once you're in, you see that we have a few things on here. What I would like to draw your attention to are a couple of things. Resources page. Here you will see, included in there are, for example, today's webcast slides, which is right there. Here's a link to download the free water audit software. Here is a link to download the one-pager that describes the base level information that we're asking you to provide. And I'll take just a moment to flash that. Here's what it looks like. I'll dive into the details of that just as soon as we hop off this website. But that it's there, and following the webcast today, we'll send this link out with the website just to make sure you have it. So everything's there. And we've even included some some examples of the data requested. So if you want to see a go-by, this is by no means the way it has to look, but if you want to see a go-by of what, for example, a system schematic might look like, then we've provided just some examples, and you're free to use that or free to just go with whatever you have, and you can see what that might look like. So all of this is just resources that are intended to make your life easier as you're gathering and then providing this information to us. So that's the resources tab. I'll note just the schedule tab that does include today's webcast. It also includes the time block that we have right now on March 5th through the 8th for the in-person workshops. There'll be a one-day workshop, so it's going to come to your area for each of those 4 days. So very soon after this, we're going to be working to identify, nail down which city, which day. For the moment, just kind of save the date for that window, and then we will alert everyone, and then of course it will be on this website, the details of the location and the address and all that type of stuff. And then a couple other things just to draw your attention to. When you have information and data gathered and you're ready to provide it to us, there is an upload portal. and we're trying to sort of stay out of email land here, just a lot of emails and attachments, and trying to keep up with things that way sometimes can be a bit burdensome. So find your utility's name, click the button, and it'll pop up for you to add a file. You'll just kind of let us know your email address, but then you can actually directly upload your information to us that way. So we'll go high tech in that respect. If you prefer another route, if you prefer to email us, that's a-okay as well. But this is there to make it a bit easier. And the last thing I want to share on the website is a function we call the Water Loss Forum, and it is simply a place to post questions, and we can post answers. And that way, likely if you have the question, then someone else probably has the question as well, and it's a place where we can publicly have some Q&A as we're going through at any point in the program. So we encourage you to use that and encourage you to check it often in case other people have asked questions that you haven't thought of yet. So those are just a few of the resources on the website that we encourage you to use. Again, it's washingtonwaterloss.org. Password is Washington lowercase. And we will provide that in a follow-up email from today's webcast. With that, I'm going to round out and just take a couple minutes here to narrate the data that we're asking you, and then I want to make sure we leave at least 10 or 15 minutes for our questions and answers. System schematic, you remember when Lucy said drawing a boundary is important? Well, we find that this is extremely helpful if you have, or if you already have one, or even just a back of the envelope type of schematic on where your water is coming from, how supply is measured, where the meters are, relative to that if you have any import or export meters. Production volume is broken down by month, and if you have multiple meters measuring production, then having a column for each meter, broken down by month of the period. Calibration test results, if you're not doing any supply meter calibration or testing, don't worry about it. But if you are, we would love to see those records of perhaps the most recently, or if you have more than that, more than one round of testing or calibration, we'd love to see that as well. Bill metered sales broken down by month and account class. You can also think of this as user type or use type. It may be, in some cases, broken down by rate code, something to distinguish what type of use is occurring, something other than just a roll-up of total consumption for a given month, breaking it down by account class. That becomes extremely helpful in the validation review process, and you'll be learning more about that in the workshop, but having that broken down by type or class is indeed very helpful and important. Anything else you've got on authorized consumption? If you keep flushing sheets, if you keep other estimated uses, if you have communications with fire departments, anything and everything like that, we'd love to see it. So provide that. And meter testing data on your customer meter, if you are doing any. And if you're not doing any, that's okay too. Don't worry about it. But we would be at least interested in learning about some of the demographics as much as you can provide. It's helpful. Lastly, on the data front, Lucy touched on these physical parameters, miles and mains, count of connections, both inactive and active. Key point there, connections, we're looking for physical service lines in the ground, so not necessarily looking for count of meters or count of customers per se, but actual service connections, physical service connections. Operating pressure, operating cost, retail unit cost with supporting calculation, and variable production cost with supporting calculation. Now, this is another one where if you're struggling with how to do the calculation or just not sure, that's okay. You can either reach out to us before, and we're happy to talk with you about it, or just do the best you can, provide us the calculation, and then we have something to work from as we are reviewing, and then we're physically together in the March workshop. So again, we're very accommodating, open arms here. So be very comfortable and forthcoming in the data that you provide. As I mentioned, the resources page has the written data request to download. All right, so everything I just went through is the base level information. We're asking that of everyone. All 10 utilities in the program, we're asking you to provide that. In addition to that, we have what I'm going to call an extra credit assignment. That means you don't have to do this, but if you are willing and able to provide us above and beyond the base level data request, then we are offering to perform some advanced analysis on that data, on more raw type data. You can see there on the screen. I'll touch on this very briefly, but we're basically going to be providing another one-pager that describes the type of data and maybe what the formats that we would like to see it in. Again, this is totally optional, but it's like anything else. Whatever you put in, the more you put in, the more you get out. So consider this an opportunity to leverage some advanced analysis from this pilot program if you are so able to provide some of that raw data, supply data, perhaps an extraction from your SCADA system, an extraction from your billing system that's more than just summary data, maybe a database with account level consumption for the year. Metering accuracy, if you're doing testing and you have a database of those test results, that type of database. And then some information on your brake repair. So that's high level. I'm not going to go further than that at this point. I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. But we will have on our website an additional sort of extra credit data assignment. And for our eager students out there, if you want to pursue that, you can download that guidance document, use that to provide to us. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be that you provide all of these things, and we actually can't necessarily guarantee we would be able to look at all those things, depending on what sort of response we see back on this extra credit assignment. But at a minimum, I think we can comfortably say at least one of these areas, if you're able to provide, and we look forward to working with you with some advanced analysis on this more detailed and sort of raw level data. All right, with that, where do we go from here? Next steps: gather your supporting documentation, compile your water audit. Well, I'd say first is go to the website, check out the website, download the guidance doc on this, what to get, then gather that information, compile the water audit, upload the information to us. Around that February 12th deadline, when you upload the information to us, is when we're going to provide you with a brief practices survey and get just a couple of operational points from you on what's happening in your system, and then mark your calendar for joining us in person in a workshop coming to a city near you in early March. So with that, looks like we got about 10 minutes left in our allotted time, and I'm going to go to our message board. And Mike and Lucy, I'll ask both of you maybe to be on the ready. It looks like we do have just a few questions coming in. And let me hit these in no particular order here. So Lucy, I'm going to direct the first one to you. It's from one of our attendees. It says, when you discuss meter calibration, is that in essence the same as meter verification electronically? So maybe speak to that and distinguish in between electronic and hydraulic aspects of meter verification.
Absolutely. The primary question I ask myself when determining whether we're discussing what we'd call a volumetric test or an electronic calibration or verification is whether water is actually involved in the process. If you're hooking an instrument up to check a signal conversion, no water involved, we'd consider that to be an electronic calibration. If instead you're working with a volume of water or a flow rate of water and passing it through a meter and taking a look at the meter's totalizer, we consider that to be a volumetric test. Sometimes a maintenance activity will involve both. You'll take a look at how the meter registers water while you're simultaneously plugged into the electronics to make sure that they're functioning correctly. And if they aren't, maybe rescaling them. You could be doing both. You may have the layer of SCADA on top of that where you're doing a SCADA loop calibration. That would be another form of electronic calibration. So with any of these activities, whatever it is that you're doing, we can talk about it, bring the documentation, and we can figure out how it's applicable to your water audit and what additional opportunities you might have for instrument maintenance. So I hope that answered it. If not, we can happily go back and forth via email or over the phone on that.
Sounds great. Thank you, Lucy. Yeah, and if you do want to do a follow-up question to one of the answers you hear from us, just type it in the chat box. All right, so next question up is back to the water chart or the water balance. Question is, where do we put leakage that we fixed last year? I'll go ahead and tackle that one and just do a quick tally back to our water balance. So the question is, where, if you have leaks that you fixed and you maybe perhaps have done an estimate on the size of those leaks and how much water was lost to those leaks, The answer is that is not something that you directly key into this process, this top-down water audit. The reason is that the top-down method actually results in a remainder left over, which is the total real loss. Those leaks that you found and fixed are embedded in there. They're included in there already inherently, but there's not something that you specify in. So it is important to, especially in this unbilled consumption, when you're looking at the box where you key in your flushing volumes or fire department volumes as unmetered, make sure that you do not include estimates of leakage found. So it is good to track that, and you want to keep it sort of a separate ledger, if you will, but it is not something that you key into the top-down water audit. It comes into play when you do the follow-on leakage component analysis that Lucy made a reference to, but we'll talk more about that later, but just be sure not to put it into the unbilled consumption. All right, just a quick look back at our questions here. All right, so here's one about timing and financial information. It says our data request is based on, or is looking at a time period for calendar year 2016. My financial information is audited on our fiscal year, which actually ends in June. What should I use for the financial part? That is a great question. It's actually one that we run into often. And the answer is, if it's relatively easy to translate a fiscal year financials to a calendar year financials, that's great. If that is not relatively easy, then it's okay for the use of the top-down audit to go with the most recently completed fiscal year numbers. This is one that we urge folks, do the best you can, and if you can fairly easily get it translated, that's great. But don't spin your wheels and spend a lot of time trying to get that. It is for the purposes of how it gets utilized in the metrics of the audit. The fiscal year financials are adequate. So great question. All right, here is here's a good one. Lucy, I'm going to punt this one to you. It's about regarding the system schematic. What format is best used? Our system is rather large and complicated. And if it's helpful, I can throw an example on the screen.
Absolutely. We can deal with complexity and complication. The system schematic, we want to pull a few pieces of information out of it. So it's helpful if we have source meters in that schematic, whether they're already a part of it or you just draw a little dot on some piece of paper and scan it, that will work. We will be curious about pressure zones, just to inform a conversation. We don't need things like hydraulic gradients, anything like that, but just to understand, if you've got multiple zones, how they relate to one another, which might be large, which might be small, if you're pumping uphill or dropping pressure from a tank, how that all works out. Will's pulling up here an example schematic where it's really kind of like a kindergarten drawing. We don't need it to be, to scale or built in AutoCAD. Just some sense of which direction the water flows, where your meters are, how they might relate to sources of supply. Generally, folks find that it's best to get out a piece of paper and draw it and label it and send it our way. If that ends up being challenging, we can work with whatever other schematics you might have on file from previous work. But simple is actually usually better than complicated with a lot of information in this regard. Will, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but I guess that would be where I would start.
Yeah, I think that's good. This is very simplistic, the one I'm showing on the screen, and John, who posed the question, your system being large and complicated. So this type of back-of-the-envelope sketch may or may not be practical for a large and complicated system, but I would dial in that it is, we want to key in on, think about as you're delineating the boundary of your water audit and where does potable water enter, and in some cases, if there's an export point, if it leaves the system, and just understanding, because that's important to identify, especially if you have multiple points of metering around the source, in that example that Lucy used. And if there's an upstream meter, maybe the raw meter, the treatment plant, and then there's a finished water meter, but the finished water meter is known to be questionable, and so it may actually make sense in the short term to look back to the raw meter potentially. So things like that, just having it sort of sketched out, it helps to facilitate the conversation. So do the best you can. And as always, feel free to send us something in the meantime and say, hey, is this kind of what you're thinking? And we can give you feedback along the way. Great question. All right, just a couple minutes left in our window, so I want to make sure we're touching back. I think we've hit most of the questions that have come in from our utilities. Feels like a pretty good spot, Mike. I might maybe punt back to you and see if there were any final comments you wanted to share before we brought things to a wrap today on the webcast.
Yeah, thanks, Will, and thanks, Lucy, for getting us oriented on this program. I think my observation is you know, the state requires two numbers, right? Total production and authorized consumption for the year, and that gives you your leak values. I think my observation here is that there's a lot more to it than that, and I hope that people are seeing that through this kind of initial you know, glimpse into kind of what this program looks like, and hopefully you're going to learn a lot about your own data and come out of this again, like I say, feeling a lot better about what your data you're collecting and how to validate that. I think it's really going to be a great program. So I'm certainly very excited about it. I'm excited about it for the utilities, for you participating, because I think it's going to be a great learning experience. So again, thank you. And at this point, it sounds like you pilot utilities will be working with the project team, and I'll make sure the project team is doing what we've asked them to do under this pilot, under this contract, and I know they will. So anyway, thanks again, and looking forward to the results.
All right, thanks, Mike, and everybody be on the lookout for an email that'll follow today's webcast, just reminding you of the program website and where to get to that data request document. And as always, we look forward to talking with you. We'll see you in early March. Everybody have a great day.